The world was burning long before America joined the war. By 1940, Europe had fallen into shadow, Poland crushed, France occupied, Britain alone beneath the bombing of the Blitz, and across the Atlantic, a nation still at peace watched the storm gather, uncertain whether it should step into it or stay behind the safety of oceans. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt understood the contradiction better than anyone. He had promised peace in the 1930s, yet by 1940 he knew that peace could not survive without power. The United States had the world's greatest industrial engine idle, cautious, waiting. But Britain was running out of ships, out of guns, out of time. In the winter of that year, Roosevelt began to reshape America's destiny not with armies, but with words. On December 29, 1940, his voice crackled over the radio in living rooms from Maine to California. Fires burned in hearths, snow fell outside, and families leaned toward the speakers of their Philco sets as Roosevelt spoke calmly, deliberately. We must be the great arsenal of democracy. For us, this is an emergency as serious as war itself. The phrase landed like thunder. An arsenal, not yet an army. Democracy itself, not just America, was under siege. Roosevelt was telling his people that neutrality was no longer innocence. It was abdication. If the dictators triumphed abroad, liberty would not survive at home. But in 1940, the United States was deeply divided. The scars of the First World War had not faded. Parents remembered sons lost in muddy trenches. Farmers remembered broken promises of making the world safe for democracy. Isolationism was not ignorance, it was grief. And grief votes. In Congress, the America First Committee, backed by figures like Charles Lindbergh and Senator Robert Taft, warned against foreign entanglements. They argued that Europe's wars were Europe's problem. Polls showed that more than 2/3 of Americans opposed sending troops overseas. Yet quietly, beneath the noise of politics, Roosevelt began to build a bridge from neutrality to aid, from peace to preparation. Throughout 1940, Britain was bleeding gold. To buy American aircraft and ammunition, it had sold its overseas investments, its merchant fleet, even its last reserves of hard currency. By the end of the year, the British Treasury could pay for only one more month of arms. Without American supplies, the island fortress would starve, and the Atlantic would fall to the Axis. Winston Churchill sent a message to Roosevelt that December. He wrote, "Give us the tools, and we will finish the job." Roosevelt read those words again and again. He knew that giving Britain the tools would require breaking laws written to keep America out of war. The United States still lived under the Neutrality Acts of the 1930s, a series of laws forbidding loans or arms sales to belligerent nations. They were born from the bitterness of the Depression and the belief that bankers had dragged America into the last war for profit. To help Britain now, Roosevelt needed a way around those acts, a legal and moral justification for rearming democracy without declaring war. The answer would be as simple as it was revolutionary. Lend, not sell. In January 1941, Roosevelt presented the idea to Congress and to the nation. Instead of trading weapons for cash, the United States would lend or lease equipment to any country whose defense was vital to the defense of the United States. The logic was pure Roosevelt pragmatic, moral, and cunning. If your neighbor's house is on fire, he explained to reporters, you don't sell him a hose, you lend it to protect your own. Behind the humor was a geopolitical earthquake. The proposed Lend-Lease bill meant that America could become the world supplier of freedom without firing a shot. Opposition was fierce. Isolationists in Congress warned that it was a blank check for war. Senator Taft asked, "How do we get the guns back after the shooting stops?" But the president pressed forward, framing the debate not as foreign charity, but as national self-preservation. He argued that if Britain fell, the Atlantic would become a German lake, and the United States would face an enemy only 1,000 miles from its shores. Newspapers took sides. The Chicago Tribune called it dictatorial. The New York Times called it inevitable. Across the country, Americans debated not only policy but identity. Were they the heirs of isolation or of leadership? In factories from Detroit to Pittsburgh, the question felt less abstract. Orders for planes, tanks, and trucks began pouring in even before the bill passed. Assembly lines that had produced cars and refrigerators now turned out B-17 bombers and Sherman tanks. Idle plants roared back to life. The Depression, which had haunted a generation, was ending not through consumer demand, but through the machinery of survival. By March 1941, the arguments in Congress reached their climax. The Senate galleries were packed. Reporters filled every seat. When the roll was called, the Lend-Lease Act passed by 60 votes to 31. On March 11, 1941, Roosevelt signed it into law, Public Law 7711, with a fountain pen that would soon cross oceans in more ways than one. That moment changed the balance of world power. The United States had not declared war, yet it had declared intent. It would now supply any nation resisting aggression, Britain, China, and eventually the Soviet Union, with the full weight of American industry. Across the Atlantic, Churchill called it the most unsorted act in the history of any nation. He was right. In a world where everything had a price, America had chosen principle. From that day on, convoys of merchant ships loaded with tanks, aircraft, food, and fuel began to flow eastward across the gray Atlantic lifelines, threading through U-boat wolf packs. Every crate bore the same silent signature, Lend-Lease, USA. And with each shipment, America inched closer to war not by decree, but by destiny. When Franklin Roosevelt signed the Lend-Lease Act on March 11, 1941, he did more than sign a bill. He opened the floodgates of America's industrial heart. The law itself was only 2 pages long, but between its lines lay the power to reshape the war. An act to promote the defense of the United States. That was its title short, almost modest. Yet within weeks it set in motion the largest transfer of material goods in human history. The first requests arrived within hours. Britain asked for destroyers, trucks, aircraft, aluminum, machine tools, and food. China requested rifles, transport planes, and medical supplies for its war against Japan. By spring, Roosevelt had approved shipments worth hundreds of millions of dollars, a sum unthinkable during the Depression, but trivial compared with what would follow. Factories that had stood silent since 1932 roared back to life. At Ford's Willow Run plant, engineers designed the world's first assembly line for bombers a mile long, turning out 1 B-24 every hour. At General Motors, automotive presses stamped tank armor instead of fenders. The arsenal of democracy was no longer a metaphor. It had pistons, gears, and night shifts. On the docks of New York, Philadelphia, and Boston, cargo manifests grew as long as novels. A typical Lend-Lease shipment contained everything from wheat flour to aircraft engines, field telephones, locomotives, boots, and chocolate bars. Each crate was stenciled USA Defense Aid. Merchant ships gathered in convoys, columns of gray hulls, escorted by destroyers through the North Atlantic, where U-boats hunted like wolves. Sailors called it the Gauntlet. More than 1,000 vessels would be lost to torpedoes before the war was over, yet the lifeline never stopped. For every ship sunk, 2 more took its place. By mid-1941, the numbers defied imagination. 12 million rifles, 100,000 trucks, 8,000 aircraft. And these were only the first orders. Congress had authorized $7 billion in aid, the largest expenditure in American history at that moment. The money flowed through the new Office of Lend-Lease Administration, headed by Roosevelt's trusted envoy Harry Hopkins, a frail man with tuberculosis, but a mind like a dynamo. Hopkins worked directly from the White House, often sleeping in a small cot beside Roosevelt's desk. Together, they reviewed shipping lists line by line, deciding which allies would get what and when. Across the Atlantic, Winston Churchill exhaled for the first time in months. British stocks of wheat and aviation fuel had fallen to critical levels. Now, tankers loaded in New Orleans and Galveston steamed east, their holds full of life. American P-40 Warhawks arrived to defend the skies of Egypt and Burma. Long before Pearl Harbor, the Stars and Stripes already flew over supply depots in Liverpool and Suez. In one radio address that summer, Roosevelt put it simply, "We are not sending our young men to fight abroad, but we are sending them in the form of planes and tanks and guns." It was both promise and prophecy. Then came June 22, 1941. Hitler invaded the Soviet Union, shattering the Nazi-Soviet pact. Within days, Roosevelt extended Lend-Lease to Moscow. Many in Congress protested, aid to communists, but Roosevelt saw only the map. "If Hitler wins there," he told Hopkins, "we will fight him alone." By autumn, the first Arctic convoys codenamed PQ and QP sailed from Iceland and Scotland toward Murmansk and Archangel. The voyages were brutal. Temperatures fell below 40 degrees C. Ice formed on gun barrels. Sailors chipped it away with hammers. German aircraft attacked from above, submarines from below. Yet the convoys delivered their cargo: tanks, trucks, aviation fuel, aluminum, canned meat, and boots, millions of boots. For the Red Army, these were as vital as bullets. By December 7, 1941, the day Japan struck Pearl Harbor, America's neutrality was finished, but the Lend-Lease network was already global. Supplies reached China through the Burma Road, a serpentine trail cut through the jungle by 2,000 laborers. Farther north, aircraft flew the hump over the Himalayas from Assam to Kunming, engines straining in thin air. To the Middle East, convoys carried rail cars, oil pumps, and food. To Australia and New Zealand, munitions and machinery. By the time America formally entered the war, its logistics empire already encircled the planet. Economists of the day struggled to measure it. Factories worked 24 hours a day. By mid-1942, half of all American production was devoted to Lend-Lease or direct military orders. The program didn't just aid allies, it rearmed America itself. Every ship built for Britain improved the Navy's own designs. Every tank exported to the Soviets refined Detroit's assembly lines. Lend-Lease blurred the line between helping others and preparing for total war. Roosevelt called it the most effective act of self-defense in our history. He was right. By protecting others, America protected itself. The figures astonished even its architects. Between March 1941 and the end of 1942, the United States shipped goods worth $12 billion, equivalent to more than $200 billion today. By war's end, that number would exceed $50 billion. Britain received the largest share, followed by the Soviet Union, China, and dozens of smaller nations from Norway to Brazil. Aid came not as gifts, but as commitments, everything used for victory, nothing wasted. Equipment that survived the war would be returned or paid for later at pennies on the dollar. Yet beyond statistics lay human meaning. A Russian infantryman wearing an American sheepskin jacket on the road to Stalingrad, a British pilot flying a Boston bomber over the North Sea. a Chinese nurse dressing wounds with bandages stamped "Made in USA." Each was a thread in the same fabric, woven across oceans by the idea that freedom's survival was a common cause. Even Adolf Hitler understood the danger. In 1942, he told his generals that America's factories are the greatest weapon of this war. He was right, though he never grasped the deeper truth that the factories were powered not by machines, but by conviction. By the end of 1942, the Lend-Lease program had become more than policy. It was a symbol of unity, proof that democracies could cooperate at a scale once thought impossible. Ships launched from Richmond, Baltimore, and Portland carried more than steel. They carried faith. Every bolt tightened, every engine tested, every convoy that reached port was a small victory for the idea that the free world could still act as one. And in that unity lay the foundation of ultimate victory. By 1943, the flood had become a tide. The great experiment Roosevelt had signed 2 years earlier now stretched across the earth from the ice of Murmansk to the deserts of Egypt, from the jungles of Burma to the docks of Liverpool. Wherever Allied soldiers fought, the echo of American engines followed. The figures alone defied comprehension. Each month, nearly 500 merchant ships left American ports loaded with Lend-Lease cargo. Their holds contained everything a war could consume: tanks, trucks, locomotives, aircraft, radar sets, food, clothing, fuel, and medicine. By the end of 1943, 3 million tons of supplies crossed the Atlantic every 30 days. No empire in history had ever moved material on that scale. For Britain, the aid meant survival. Lend-Lease fed the island, equipped its armies, and powered its factories. By 1943, almost 2/3 of British imports arrived through the program. Canned food from the Midwest filled ration books. Aluminum from Tennessee became Spitfire wings. Even the uniforms worn by Royal Navy sailors were stitched in New Jersey. Churchill told Parliament, "The moment the United States decided to lend and lease, we were saved." In return, British scientists and engineers shared radar, jet propulsion, and code-breaking expertise, a silent exchange that helped forge the modern alliance between Washington and London. The cooperation of industry and science that began under Lend-Lease would outlast the war itself. For the Soviet Union, the aid was equally decisive, though often misunderstood. The Red Army fought and died in unimaginable numbers, 20 million lives lost, yet behind the front stood an invisible American lifeline. Between 1941 and 1945, the United States shipped to the USSR 400,000 trucks, 13,000 locomotives and rail cars, 14,000 aircraft, 37,500 tons of explosives, and over 4 million tons of food. The trucks mattered most. They turned Soviet offensives from slow marches into mechanized thrusts. At Stalingrad, at Kursk, and finally on the road to Berlin, half the Red Army's transport ran on gasoline, refined in Texas. Soviet Marshal Zhukov later admitted, "Without the Lend-Lease trucks, we could not have pursued the Germans so quickly." In the Arctic ports of Murmansk and Archangel, American crews unloaded cargo under bombardment, while Soviet workers dragged crates across frozen docks. Steel rails, boots, field kitchens, aircraft engines, mountains of them. The friendship was uneasy, the gratitude sometimes hidden, but the steel spoke for itself. In China and the Pacific, Lend-Lease took a different shape. Because Japanese forces controlled the seas, supplies had to cross the sky or crawl through mountains. Over the Himalayas, transport pilots flew the hump, climbing to 20,000 feet in unpressurized C-47s, engines icing, navigation uncertain. Each ton of cargo delivered to Kunming cost $3 in fuel and sweat, yet the flights never stopped. On the ground, Chinese mechanics assembled American jeeps and trucks into convoys that kept Chiang Kai-shek's armies alive. The Lend-Lease symbol appeared in Mandarin on supply crates, Mei Guo Yuan Zhu, meaning assistance from America. At home, the transformation was total. By 1943, American industrial output exceeded that of Germany, Japan, and Italy combined. Factories worked in continuous shifts. Welders slept in locker rooms between 12-hour turns. Women now made up 1/3 of the industrial labor force. Their hands built the tanks and planes shipped abroad. In Michigan, a girl named Clara Bowers welded the same joint on Sherman tanks for 3 years 12,000 times, she later said, and each one went somewhere I'd never see. The war had erased unemployment. It had also erased the illusion that democracy and efficiency could not coexist. Roosevelt had promised to make America the arsenal of democracy. By 1943, it was the arsenal of the world. Logistics itself became a weapon. The U.S. Merchant Marine operated more than 6,000 vessels, a floating city of men and steel. Shipyards delivered Liberty and Victory ships faster than the sea could claim them. Each carried enough cargo to supply a division for a month. When convoy HX-239 reached Britain in June 1943 without losing a single ship, newspapers called it a quiet victory greater than any battle. Behind that victory stood a network of unseen hands, dock workers, crane operators, sailors, truck drivers, millions of anonymous participants in the choreography of war. Lend-Lease turned logistics into destiny. As the tide of battle turned, so did politics. In January 1943, Roosevelt and Churchill met at Casablanca and again later with Stalin at Tehran. At those conferences, Lend-Lease statistics became arguments for strategy. Because the United States could supply so much, it could also demand coordination, a single Allied timetable, unified command, combined production boards. The material generosity carried weight. When Roosevelt spoke, his allies listened, not only because of his words, but because of what arrived in their ports every week. By 1944, the stream became a flood. That year alone, America produced 96,000 aircraft, 45,000 tanks, and 8 million tons of foodstuffs for export. Ships left ports in a continuous procession, their wakes stretching across every ocean. In the Mediterranean, U.S. trucks moved British and Free French forces through Italy. In India, American machinery built airfields from jungle clay. In Alaska, convoys handed over aircraft to Soviet pilots who ferried them across the Bering Strait. The war had become a single interconnected machine, and the United States was its engine. When Allied armies landed in Normandy on June 6, 1944, the trucks that rolled onto French beaches bore American markings. Fuel from Lend-Lease pipelines pushed the advance all the way to Paris. Behind the headlines of D-Day stood a quiet miracle of supply planned years before, the arsenal feeding the offensive that would end the war. As victory approached, new questions arose. What would happen when the fighting stopped? Would the arsenal still be needed? Could America simply turn off the tap? Roosevelt never saw the end. He died in April 1945, 1 month before Germany's surrender. But the machinery he built did not die with him. Harry Hopkins and his successor, Edward Stettinius, oversaw the winding down of shipments, ensuring that food and fuel continued until peace was secured. Even after VE Day, American freighters carried relief supplies to liberated Europe, the final echo of Lend-Lease before a new era began. When the program formally ended on September 2, 1945, the day Japan surrendered, its totals staggered historians. Over $50 billion in goods delivered to 38 countries, the equivalent of more than $700 billion today. Britain received about $31 billion, the Soviet Union $11 billion, France and China smaller but vital shares. Yet beyond numbers lay the transformation of the global order. The United States had discovered that economic power could project influence farther than armies ever could. The phrase arsenal of democracy had evolved into something larger, a doctrine, a template for how America would engage the world for the rest of the century. Lend-Lease proved that isolation was illusion and that industrial strength, guided by purpose, could defend not just a nation, but an ideal. Across the ocean, Churchill wrote to President Truman, "We never forget that you were the arsenal of our victory, and that when the light had gone out everywhere else, the lamps of your factories still burned." And in Moscow, where trains of American trucks still rattled east toward Siberia, a Soviet newspaper printed a rare acknowledgement. The road to Berlin was paved with American steel. Those lines were not exaggeration. They were gratitude written in iron. The guns fell silent in 1945, but the engines of the arsenal did not. For 6 years, America had built for war. Now it had to learn how to build for peace. Across the Atlantic and Pacific, ships unloaded their final cargoes, crates stamped Lend-Lease USA, stacked on the ruins of cities that the program had helped to save. Factories that once forged cannon barrels now produced tractors. Aluminum plants switched from bombers to refrigerators. But the moral weight of what had been done lingered. Billions in aid, millions of lives changed, and a world remade in the image of production. In Washington, the accountants began their slow work. They calculated that from 1941 to 1945, the United States had provided $50.1 billion worth of goods, roughly 1/5 of all the war material used by the Allies. Britain's share alone equaled nearly half its entire wartime budget. The Soviet Union's shipments, though smaller in money, were enormous in scale enough to equip entire armies. Now came the question no one had wanted to ask during the fighting. How would it all be repaid? Technically, Lend-Lease had never been a gift. The law said that payment or return of property would occur after the war in kind, or by benefit to the United States. But how do you measure repayment for survival? In the summer of 1945, the British delegation arrived in Washington carrying ledgers thicker than Bibles. They came not to settle debts, but to plead for mercy. Britain was bankrupt, its gold reserves gone, its empire collapsing, its people still on rations. The U.S. Treasury eventually forgave most of the balance and converted the rest into long-term, low-interest loans. The final payment on those debts would not be made until 2006, 61 years later. The Soviet Union took a different path. It repaid almost nothing, arguing that its battlefield losses had already paid the price in blood. Diplomatic tension soon froze gratitude into suspicion. By 1947, the former Allies were adversaries, and the crates once marked Lend-Lease had become relics of a friendship too brief for memory. Still, the moral impact of Lend-Lease reached farther than any balance sheet. It had proven that democracy could mobilize faster, produce more, and coordinate better than any totalitarian system. In 1939, American generals doubted that a free economy could sustain total war. By 1945, they no longer doubted anything. The arsenal of democracy had shown that liberty itself could be efficient. Factories, universities, and laboratories kept their momentum. The research networks that had coordinated radar, aluminum alloys, and synthetic rubber evolved into peacetime institutions. The National Science Foundation, the Rand Corporation, the Atomic Energy Commission. The same engineers who managed supply chains for tanks now managed production for cars, highways, and homes. The techniques of Lend-Lease became the backbone of the American century. The program also transformed how the world saw America. Before 1941, the United States had been a reluctant giant, a power that preferred its own continent. After Lend-Lease, it was a nation whose factories reached across oceans. It no longer sold weapons. It exported security, stability, and the promise of partnership. That idea that prosperity could defend freedom would shape every alliance that followed, from the Marshall Plan to NATO to modern foreign aid. When Roosevelt had said that America must be the great arsenal of democracy, he had not meant a single war. He had meant a principle, that strength shared is strength multiplied. There were critics, of course. Some argued that the program had been too generous, that it had allowed Britain to cling to empire or given Stalin the tools of future tyranny. Others claimed it had dragged America into conflicts that were not its own. Yet, history answered them in statistics too clear to deny. The war was won not by isolation, but by interdependence. No ally, however brave, could have stood alone. Lend-Lease turned separate struggles into a single cause, and it had another quieter legacy one, written not in treaties, but in lives. In Liverpool, an old woman remembered the American canned peaches that arrived during the Blitz, the first taste of sweetness in months. In Leningrad, a boy grew up wearing boots marked U.S. Army. He would later fight at Kursk and survive. In China, a doctor trained with American medical supplies and founded a hospital that still exists today. For them, Lend-Lease was not a policy, it was proof that help could cross oceans. When historians later called World War II the War of Logistics, they meant more than tonnage. They meant the moral logistics of cooperation, the movement of trust. Before 1941, nations hoarded resources in fear. After Lend-Lease, they learned that sharing them could change the world. In 1948, British diplomat Lord Keynes, who had negotiated the repayment terms, wrote privately, "What was given under Lend-Lease was not simply material aid. It was confidence, the rarest currency in a world that had lost it. That confidence became the seed of a new order, an international system built not just on power, but on production shared among partners." Even the enemies of 1941 could not escape its legacy. Post-war Japan and Germany rebuilt their industries under American guidance, using methods first tested in Lend-Lease logistics, standardized production, modular design, mass transport. The same principles that had armed the Allies now fueled global recovery. The arsenal of democracy had become the workshop of peace. By the time the last Lend-Lease loans were repaid in the early 21st century, the world that Roosevelt and Churchill had fought to defend was unrecognizable, global, interconnected, imperfect, but freer than the one they inherited. Every container ship, every foreign aid convoy, every humanitarian airlift still carries the ghost of that 1941 law. Whenever nations share resources for a common purpose, they echo a signature written on a March morning in Washington, Franklin D. Roosevelt. Today, the original copies of the Lend-Lease Act rest in the National Archives. The paper has yellowed, but the ink remains sharp, the same blue-black strokes that once authorized hope. Next to them sits a pen capped in gold, the one Roosevelt used to sign his name. It's small, ordinary, easy to overlook. Yet with that pen, he connected continents and rewrote the meaning of distance.